Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father John Lovell with another episode of Hope in the Desert. We have back a great friend, both to the podcast Hope in the Desert, but also to canceled priests, David Rodriguez of the Fatima Center. David, how are you, sir?
Doing well, Father. Thank you for having me on in this wonderfully crisp autumn that we're experiencing, at least where I live.
Oh, absolutely. A wonderful, crisp autumn where I am, too. We are both relatively in the north. My producer, Matthias, is in the deep part of Texas, so it's probably still very much summer there. But normally, when I have you on, we speak about Mary, obviously, and the Fatima apparitions. Sometimes I like to pepper you with questions about Our Lady of La Salette. But today I want to speak about the priesthood. And before we begin, I want to read a little prayer by a Dominican named Father Lacordaire, a French Dominican. He said this about the priesthood. It's almost like a poem. To live in the midst of the world without wishing its pleasures, to be a member of each family yet belonging to none, to share all suffering, to penetrate all secrets, to heal all wounds, to go from men to God and offer him their prayers, to return from God to men, to bring pardon and hope, to have a heart of fire for charity and a heart of bronze for chastity, to teach and to pardon, console and bless always. My God, what a life, and it is yours, O priest of Jesus Christ. What a wonderful poem, pretty much a prayer almost. And it certainly inspired me over 25 years ago now to start studying for the priesthood. I'm on my 19th year of priesthood. There was recently in Crisis Magazine an article by Kevin Wells, and Kevin Wells is a wonderful author and journalist, writes for many publications, including Crisis Magazine. We are big supporters of Eric Sammons here and Crisis Magazine in general. But he wrote an excellent piece called The Unspoken Trial of the Orphaning of Our Priests. And many of you might not know this, but David Rodriguez has an older brother, Father Michael Rodriguez, who is one of the holiest priests I ever met. And I say that because there's very few people in my life, and I've been alive now for 45 years, that I've been around that I've had this immense calm of being in their presence. And Father Rodriguez is certainly one of those. But Father Rodriguez is also a canceled priest. And I wanted to dedicate this episode to what happens to a family when a priest gets canceled. And so, David, I just want to ask you if you could kind of go through, we were actually talking about this right before the show began, a little bit about your own vocational story, which brought you to the seminary for a little bit, and also your brother. I hope he does not mind if we talk to him about him in very good terms, of course, and just where he is at now and how the Rodriguez family as a whole is dealing with his persecution.
Well, there's a lot there, Father. So maybe just starting with a few facts. My family is from Texas, El Paso, Texas. So that's where we were born and raised. I come from a family of 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. And we'd been Catholic all our lives. Although we certainly did get raised in the new Mass, the Novus Ordo. I think actually my father was pretty gung-ho when a lot of the changes came, because he was born in 42. So he's in his 20s, and he and my mom were getting married in 66, right around that time when all these changes are hitting the parishes. So that's a bit of our background, but we were definitely raised, I would say, in a pious family. My mother and father strove to have us, read the Bible and pray the rosary every day, go to Mass on Sundays, and oftentimes even during the week. Like, great tradition was we'd go Saturday morning at 6:30 a.m. and on the way home, Dad would get us donuts. So, people like to get up for the 6:30 Mass on Saturday, which was the only day I think that would happen. Anyway, Father Rodriguez did go to the seminary right out of high school. That's a fascinating story, too, because he actually left for the summer between his junior and senior years of high school. And he's very, very intelligent. He was a brain, especially in math and science. And so he got accepted into a special program at the Massachusetts Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in between those 2 years of high school. And he goes up there, and my dad's got a PhD in electrical engineering. So we all thought, that's kind of where Father Rodriguez is going. And he gets off the plane when he comes back from the summer program, and like the first words out of his mouth are, "I'm going to go be a priest. I'm going to the seminary." So it sort of shocked us all. But over the 8 years of his seminary, we realized that this was God's call for him. And Father was ordained in 1996. So he's been a priest for, closing in on 30 years now. And of course, 8 years before that is kind of when he dedicates his life and everything to the church. You mentioned and asked me to do a little bit of my own sort of vocation discernment, very, very briefly. I also was following those footsteps of my father, looking to study. Well, I was studying electrical engineering, getting my master's in that, but felt very dissatisfied with just kind of the worldliness of everything. Something was missing in my life, I could tell. And by then, my brother was a priest, and he was actually the vocations director for the diocese. And so I thought, maybe God's calling me to be a priest. So I did enter the seminary for the Diocese of El Paso. This was back in 1999, and spent a couple of years. I actually kind of made a private, personal agreement. I'm not sure I would go so far as a vow, but I probably took it as a personal vow or promise. Promise is probably the better word, to God, that I would try this out for 2 years, because I wasn't certain. And I do encourage men to do that, to really, just give it a year, give God 2 years, because even though that was not my vocation, and there were some tough, tough years, I'm very grateful for those years, and they've shaped me into, frankly, being a much better father and husband. My wife sometimes jokes around and says, "If you hadn't gone to the seminary, there's no way I would have married you. Like you didn't get formed right. You'd have been missing a lot." So off I went to the seminary for the Diocese of El Paso, and unfortunately, very quickly ran into just a lot of the belly of the underbeast, to put it mildly. This was certainly before even the Dallas Charter, so maybe a lot of the terrible clerical scandals that have sort of rocked our church since then had come to light. But I was seeing it all. I mean, I was seeing financial malfeasance, knowing of priests that were embezzling money. I was seeing priests who were making sexual advances on the young seminarians. We dealt with that while I was there. And I was dealing with nonstop heresy in the classroom, and so I felt like I was spending all my time just trying to defend the faith, the bit that I knew, which wasn't much, against like these heretical attacks. And it was not very peaceful. So I left, but I did love theology by then, and I went to the University of Dallas studying for a master's in theology, which I completed, and then decided maybe try it again, this time with a Cistercian monastery. And they were much, much more faithful. They had a good liturgy. They had some Latin in there, even though they had the new Mass, and they were all Hungarian Cistercians. Very, very much imbued with the spirit of the Vatican II theologians like Henri de Lubac and Yves Congar and von Balthasar and those fellows. So I still got my master's of theology under them, but they still had a lot of solid stuff. And I got to read church fathers. After a year of the monastery, which was really, it helped me heal personally from a lot of the negative stuff I saw when I was in the diocesan seminary. But I also realized that the monastery was not my call. And I left. And then then I married my wife back in 2005. So we've got about 20 years, closing in on 21 now. And we have 7 children. God has blessed me with 6 girls and 1 boy. And after leaving the seminary and having that master's in theology, I've kind of dedicated my life to working within the Catholic Church in various nonprofits, Catholic radio, as you mentioned earlier. Right now, I work at the Fatima Center. I also work with the St. Vincent Ferrer Foundation, small little group that seeks to help recover and restore all Catholic tradition. So that's a bit of me.
No, you bring up an excellent point. One thing, because your timeline and my timeline, at least entering the seminary, is almost identical. I entered in 1998. I was at Loyola University in Chicago at the College Seminary for the Archdiocese of Chicago. I was actually, about after 2.5 years there, I was kicked out by the formation program. Cardinal George stepped in and said, "No, we're not letting him go." And he sent me not to a Cistercian monastery, but to a Benedictine monastery at Conception Abbey and Conception Seminary College in Missouri to finish. And while they were also very much imbued with the council and the Novus Ordo, they could sing on key. They sang songs that were not necessarily heretical. They chanted the office. Granted, it was the Novus Ordo. Granted, it was in English, but they sang it well, and I was able to, in the last 2 to 3 semesters of college, kind of uh, absorb just the quietness of an abbey, and realize, because it was a complete difference, um, compared to St. Joseph's College Seminary in Chicago, which is now closed. It was basically a dormitory in the middle of the city in Rogers Park on Loyola's campus, and there weren't a lot of rules. And you could not tell that it was really a seminary, other than the fact that we had mass Monday through Friday. We didn't even have mass on the weekends. They just
Right.
assumed you were going to go somewhere on Sundays for mass. But one thing that you mentioned, which I think a lot of people don't understand, is I am a big believer that men, especially, should spend 6 weeks in some type of boot camp, whether it's Marine, Army, something along the military lines, uh, at least 6 months serving in a restaurant, which I've spent actually several years serving in a restaurant, and then at least 1 year in a monastery, at least 1 year. And because what I've noticed, I've done two of those three things. I've never been through boot camp, but I know many people that have, and I admire them for their discipline and for their work ethic. Is that it's amazing that when you work in the restaurant industry, and when you have the quietness of an abbey, of a monastery, to really learn how to pray, it really helps you later in life. And as a canceled priest, I could tell you that it has uh, been very helpful to know that while I might be abandoned by my bishop, and by, sad to say, my brother priests, many of whom have just kind of turned on me, even priests that were students of mine that are now priests, and I'm part of the reason they went to seminary. Obviously, the Holy Ghost is the main reason. They just kind of turned their back on me because I'm canceled. How is a family, and maybe if you can go not necessarily into great detail, but if you could tell us a little bit about what happened with your brother, how he ended up canceled, and how that affected the family. You obviously come from a very large family. How did that affect the family?
Yeah, I'll just dovetail to lead into that with something you said. I don't know if I've told you, but I was at Mundelein Seminary there in Chicago from 2001 to 2000 fall to 2001 spring. So that's where I did my first year of theology, and met Cardinal George, and he came on campus several times. But like you're saying, mass was sketchy. One of while I was there, two of the young men left together to be together.
Mm.
So they decided they were going to be together. And when I was at the previous seminary, a young man who had been ordained a deacon already, so he'd already taken vows, also left because he had gotten a girl pregnant. So all of these things were hitting, and I was seeing it everywhere. Um, and so Father Rodriguez was seeing this also as a priest, in the diocese, and a lot of the different things going on. And he hadn't really put his finger yet on what was happening as I was struggling with that. And I would say that a big change for him comes about really in just learning about the Latin Mass. And then that's not just the liturgy that you learn about, but he started learning about all the Catholic tradition and all the things he had not been taught in all of these years of seminary. I mean, I remember one time sitting at his table and he's just kind of like reminiscing. He's like, I wish I could go back and do seminary all over, because there's so much, these 8 years that I didn't learn that I'm trying now to learn. And so he was burning the candle at two ends. I mean, he was working all day, and everyone kind of knew him in the diocese as the most faithful priest. So he wouldn't tell you no if you needed confessions or you needed this or you needed that. I mean, this is Novus Ordo, and I don't recommend this for any priest, but I think on a First Friday, he was doing about maybe 7 or 8 different masses at all kinds of different locations, including, finishing up at a holy hour of adoration at a convent for nuns. They had perpetual adoration there. But anyway, so he's doing all this, and then he'd get home, and the day's finally done around 10 o'clock for him, and then he starts studying. He starts studying the faith, because some of the laity had spoken to him about the Latin Mass. And so that started already, I think, creating a bit of a rift between him and the other priests and the bishop. But the real problem came for him when he just tried to defend Christ's truth. I mean, I really see him as St. John the Baptist, because El Paso is a completely blue city, very democratic run. Although you'd be familiar with it, Father Lovell, because I often call it a little Chicago. They want to be, it's a wannabe Chicago in terms of the politics and how corrupt things are. Now you have a huge dimension in El Paso because we're right on the border. So it is the biggest border entry for drugs into this country from Mexico coming through. So there's the violence, there's the drug. It's a minimum wage town. So the education, I mean, it's a tough place, you know? And so the politicians are incredibly corrupt, and they were preempting this Supreme Court decision, the Obergefell thing that came down whenever it did, trying to redefine marriage. So this is before that even. The city council decided that they were going to extend benefits that are normally reserved for spouses that are married to all those that were living together. I guess you could be shacking, or you could, of course, be flying under these so-called rainbow flags. And so a lot of people didn't like that. We said, you can't use our tax money for that. And the city council ignored us, and so we had to have we actually had to have a popular referendum. And a lot of us, including myself, were out there day after day on the streets, going from house to house, standing outside churches. There were all these rules, like you had to stand a certain distance and things, but we followed all those rules and collected all these signatures. So the city had to put it to a vote, and the people voted it down. So we were very happy about that. Then nonetheless, the city council voted it like in the other direction, which that's kind of when I sort of started losing a lot of my belief in democracy. Because I was like, this was the most democratic thing that could happen, a popular referendum, and the city vote. So then we had to go after them. And so we had to go after the mayor, who actually went to mass at the church where I received First Holy Communion and was a regular communicant. And he was the deciding vote, claiming to be Catholic. But he and some of the city council members who voted against us, we wanted to remove them. And in the end, we did, but then they just logged it down in courts. Well, while all that was going on, it was a big talk in the city. And so the newspaper was publishing editorials. And Father Rodriguez published a few editorials because someone paid for them that wasn't even living in El Paso. And they wanted to present church teaching. And Father was like, yeah, I'll write these articles. So Father wrote some articles at their request, and they submitted them. And it was, I still have them, but they were just very clear church teaching on what it is, full of charity and full of kindness. And then crazily enough, one of the priests starts writing against him now. So you had in the public sphere these two priests kind of like dissenting opinions. That priest has since gone on to become a bishop and is one of the most pro-Sodomite. He kind of like has the rainbow flags flying in every one of his churches. And I've known people who've seen him and are very disappointed with him. It's sad. The scandal is bad. Some people have even seen that they've been at a hotel and they see him coming out in the morning with another man. That never looks good. So, anyway, no surprise that he was writing contrary to church teaching in these newspapers, but the bishop was very displeased, and the mayor wound up calling him because the mayor didn't like the fact that Father Rodriguez had presented true Catholic teaching. And then, unfortunately, there were some laity, it was a confluence of things, who really betrayed Father and said a lot of lies and calumny about him. But they were able to use that to paint him in very bad lights, to accuse him of embezzling funds, to accuse him of all sorts of things, none of which was true. But with that, they took that as the motion to sort of sack him and move him out into very far reaches, the Siberia of the diocese. And then after that, since he was adamant about offering the Latin Mass, back in those days, he was actually still offering the new Mass and the Latin Mass. But once he got sent to Siberia and there was a small group of people there, and they already had a priest who was offering the Mass there, Father was able to offer the Latin Mass exclusively. And that, again, really transformed his priesthood. So I really thought it was like the story of Burr Rabbit, where he wants to be thrown to the briar patch, and that actually works really well for him. And I'm like, well, that's what the bishop did to you. He threw you into the briar patch, and you're flourishing here, which did happen to him. So God is always working in these good ways. But since then, the bishop has, there's been another bishop too, but they've continued their persecution of him, and they refuse to sort of give him a parish. And again, every time they present something in any one of their writings or in a newspaper, things like that, they completely twist the facts. That's the thing that's disappointed me so much, that there's a clear intent to really deceive people, complete manipulation of the truth, there's no integrity. And that's what I think a lot of people may not realize is hurting our canceled priests. I would think just about with every priest that's been canceled, do not believe the things that you're hearing about them in many cases. It's tough because maybe some are actually guilty of heinous sins. Now, a lot of times if they are, they're not even reprimanded. But, you got to, if you know the priest and you know he's a good priest, be careful. There's a lot of lies that are being said. It's real sad. And so that has really, it did devastate our family. And that's what you'd asked me about. So there's many things. In my case, it may have affected us a little bit more than most families. I don't know, but I'm very close to my brother, and I'd helped him out at different parishes. And for good or for evil, I seem to be associated a lot with him. Certainly the name and the facial resemblance does a lot of that. And so what I came to realize is that if people liked Father Rodriguez, they tended to get like me and give me the benefit of the doubt, even though they may not meet me, have met me before. And people who didn't like Father Rodriguez just thought I was evil as well, and would sort of like have nothing to do with me. And so it really hurt our family. I mean, we had a lot of closely connected to many people. And I mean, you had people that came to your house and had dinner with you. And then suddenly they're like, well, we can never talk to you again and we don't have anything to do with you. And you're like, what? Like, what does this have to do with our friendship? But that's kind of where people go. So, and that of course hurts everyone, right? That hurts my wife, that hurts the children. In a very, it's kind of unique here, but the bishop actually leveled a civil lawsuit against Father Rodriguez. Which again, if any priest, anyone in the know realizes immediately that's bizarre, because the last thing that the bishops want is civil court cases. I mean, they'll pay all kinds of money to stay out of civil court cases. So to
Yes.
actually have a bishop civilly go after his priest is pretty unheard of. But again, all false information. In fact, the faithful countersued the bishop. And so then the faithful were going to drag the bishop into the lawsuit, and the bishop didn't like that. But of course, he's got scores of money more than the faithful, and so he was basically telling them, "Look, I'll give you some money, and then you just have to go away and leave this court case alone. And if you don't, then I'll just drag this on forever and take away all your funds. I'll drain you." So the people did wind up accepting with that. But at least, in the public sphere, it was aware that after they had tried to sue Father, that the faithful countersued and basically said, no, the bishop's misrepresenting information, and Father Rodriguez didn't steal it, and actually the bishop's one who's got our money. But that became a big problem. And in the light of all that, our family was certainly taking like these, let's say, really big hits from people we knew, getting ostracized. Instead of, I had actually purchased a home just blocks from his parish. So we could
Yeah.
walk to mass. And now I'm like stuck with a real estate property. This is the financial side that like no one wants, and it's in a bad part of town because that's where they put the Latin mass. And now I have no mass to go to, and my brother's far away. So we're driving 3 hours here, 3 hours there on a Sunday, one way just to get to mass. I cannot say how many times the faithful came and sat in my, on my couch in my living room and just cried their hearts out over the sadness of what was ripping families apart, ripping communities apart. And there was just so much sorrow. And it was tough because it was so unjust. I mean, all these petitions were sent to the bishop from, I don't know, 15, 17 different parishes in the diocese about how Father was a good priest. I think the bishop started getting irritated because he'd be at Walmart or a restaurant or a festival, and somebody would come up and be like, hey, why don't you send Father Rodriguez to be our parish priest? We want him. And I kept getting these reports about how people were seeing him in different parts of the city and saying that. And he was getting really fed up with that, I'm sure. But he knew Father was a good priest. And even the people where he got sent to in Siberia, they wanted him there when he took him away. They're like, no, leave him here. If it's a drain on the diocese, we'll pay all his everything. Take him off the salary and the health insurance and blah, blah, blah. We'll cover all expenses. And he wouldn't. They won't do it. And instead, they tell us that we have a shortage of priests, but here we have good priests, and they won't let them, actually work, which was the thing that a lot of people were clamoring in the diocese. Like, this is a great priest. We want him, and we want him at our
Yeah.
parish. And the bishop's like, no. So it's that's what really hurts. And in my case too, there was a lot more. I mean, it's a long, long story. But when the bishop got upset and levied this lawsuit against Father Rodriguez, he was upset at me also because they had lied to us. They had told us they were going to continue the Latin Mass to show up to this one Sunday after Father Rodriguez had gotten banished. And so we did show up. Fortunately, we had some intel that told us that they probably weren't going to do the Latin Mass. And sure enough, they didn't. It was the bishop there who then did the Novus Ordo, peppering some Latin in there. And then the sermon was quite Gnostic and quite heretical. And so when the sermon was over, I actually was in the front row, and I got out of my pew, I knelt to the tabernacle, turned around and walked out of the church because I was like, this is what I came here for, and that we were lied to. And I'd say about 80%, maybe 85% of the church followed suit. And so the bishop was not happy with that. I'd been one of his seminarians. And so he called me that Monday and I asked him, well, why'd you lie to us? He didn't really want to hear that. But I think in large because, and then we started a big campaign. We were actually outside the chancery for about over 1,000 days was over 3 years. We had a count. I could go back and look at it. I'm not sure if we hit 1,100 days, but it was over 1,000 days that we were outside the chancery praying a rosary or Stations of the Cross on Friday with our signs asking for us to get the Latin Mass back. And that bishop wound up leaving the diocese, and another bishop came in, and he's the one who finally brought the Latin Mass back to the diocese. But because of those things and my involvement in sort of spearheading that grassroots organization of the laity, the bishop sued me as well in that lawsuit, like for no reason. He just sued me as well. And I was shocked by that. My poor wife, that was really hard on her. I mean, she physically, I mean, just all kinds of things started coming out physically for her. We had the news cameras outside, parked outside our house. People wanting to like interview us and talk to us and like, what malfeasance have you done? And the bishop's suing you. And so I had to actually get my wife and my children out of town. Like they had to leave while all of this was exploding. And I don't have any money, and so I had to defend myself pro se. And the judge was looking at me like I was crazy, saying, you know what you're doing? Like, this is not going to go well for you if you try to defend yourself pro se. And I was like, well, Judge, I mean, I don't have any money, and I'll only speak the truth, and I haven't done any of these things, so I don't have anything to hide. I mean, I know they can try and twist things, but I'm going to trust in the truth. And in the end, it never did go to trial. The bishop had nothing, and so they just dragged it on for years, and it stayed in the docket. And then the new bishop came in, and he realized I had nothing here, so they actually, took me off the case. And eventually they just dropped the case altogether. So it came to nothing. It was a nothing burger, right? But it made a lot of noise and smeared his name, my name, a lot of people's names through the mud. And oftentimes that's all they want. And they have the money to spend, that if they can just tarnish your reputation, that gets the effect that they want. And that's certainly what happened in our case. So, I mean, there's been so much sorrow. I can't explain how much, but there's also been a lot of grace. I mean, I so sympathize. I live St. Paul, right, when he says that where sin abounds, grace abounds the more, and that God won't give you trials that you can't handle, because there's been a lot of grace in our, in the crosses that we've had to bear with all of this. God's been very good. Some of the crosses, for example, was leaving. At some point, it just got so crazy for us. All the difficulties from, like I was saying, the friends who no longer wanted to talk to you, and priests talking badly about you, and life was difficult. And it was like, and then we lost the Latin Mass, and I was like, there's no reason for us to even live here anymore. Like, let's move. So, I mean, we sold our house, we packed up all our belongings, and we moved 2,000 miles away to try to just get away from it all and get some peace and some distance to try to like put back your life. So that's how devastating it can be, to the point where you have to abandon kind of everything and go to a place where no one knows you and kind of start over because of these attacks, completely unjust and wrong that they do. But like I say, in the end, I'm happy we suffer it for Christ. Any crosses he sends me, I know it'll be tough, but there'll be a lot of grace. So that's just real short, the short end of it.
No, you hit it right on the nail, where we have bishops literally suing their priests and their faithful in order basically not to be proven wrong. And it's quite sad, but I often tell people this. Probably the best thing that could have happened to my priesthood was being canceled. I was ordained about 2 months before Summorum Pontificum came out. I was one of the priests that did it. I enjoyed the traditional mass, but I was put, especially early on in my priesthood, I was put in the part of the Diocese of Rockford, in the Chicago suburbs, at very wealthy, very comfortable parishes. And I could have easily fallen into that life of just rolling with the punches, not rocking the boat too much, which I know many priests do. And it was because I was canceled for standing up for the truth at a local Catholic high school that I taught at, again, at the command of the bishop. I exposed some very nasty things going on, that it eventually started me being canceled. And then when I was out of ministry, and I spent years out of ministry, simply praying the old office, simply saying the old mass, low mass. Obviously, I was by myself. It was a low mass, but I found the beauty of that, and it was really tradition saved me. And don't get me wrong, we have, especially on this platform, Pelican Plus, we have a wonderful program, an episode by Kennedy Hall about trad burnout. And that could certainly happen. But I can tell you, as a canceled priest, and speaking to many canceled priests, including your own brother, just the beauty of tradition that has kind of preserved us. And as I said at the top of the show, your brother is always come across as very, very calm. I asked you before, a couple of days ago when we talked about doing this episode, to read, and I sent you the article, The Unspoken Trial of Orphaning of Our Priests by Kevin Wells. And Kevin Wells's brother is Father David Wells of the Archdiocese of Washington. He was a few years behind me at Mount St. Mary's. Um, and then also Kevin Wells's uncle was Monsignor Wells, who was brutally murdered in his own rectory. But it's a very long article. We will put a link for that. Matthias, my producer, if you'd be so kind to remember to put a link, especially on YouTube, for the article for people to read that might not have read it. What were your thoughts about the article, though, David, reading it?
Well, I think it's a very good article. I think more people should read it. I think it's information that still a lot of people don't know. So I'd encourage everyone to go and read it. It gives you a good insight into some of what's going on. I'll actually probably also be linking that article through the St. Vincent Ferrer website we have. So I'm going to get it up there, I think, later on today, God willing, if I can get to that task. Um, one of the parts I really liked, and again, maybe this is because of the family and still touching on the previous question, we have to support our priests so much, the ones that are good. And I think a lot of priests oftentimes don't necessarily have the courage to remain faithful to Christ because, like all of us, you're still living in the world, and you are worried about your salary, you are worried about your insurance, you're worried about where the next meal or your shoes and the roof over your house are going to come. And boy, I mean, the stories I've heard, I've gotten to know canon lawyers and I've gotten to know a lot of different priests, the kinds of ways that bishops start pressuring their priests and putting the screws to them. It's horrifying that like any person would do this to another person, let alone a bishop, let alone to one of his priests. I mean, it's sickening, and it's going on all the time, and people don't realize this. And I mean, the one thing I would have said about, my one critique to the article is it is still way too soft, and it still wasn't like strong enough, and it still was not exposing like the worst and the clearest things. So, I mean, I know a lot more. And so as he's alluding to things or he says things, I kind of pick up on that. I'm like, yeah, but there's like 5 more steps of more evil that you're not touching on, probably because people maybe just can't take it or can't believe it. But believe you me, it's true. And again, now I'm going to switch here just very briefly, like from the theological side. One of the things that I think we often fail to understand, and we're not taught this, and this article brought it out really well, which is why it came to my mind, is that the bishop is supposed to be a spiritual father to his priests. And I haven't talked to one priest who if we don't touch that topic, if we touch that topic, who doesn't basically say, I've been orphaned. I have been orphaned. And so we have all of these bishops who have basically abandoned their spiritual fatherhood of the priests. And instead of being like a father, and we all know what a good father is supposed to be like. I mean, he cares about you. He's interested. He helps you grow. He's got your back. He certainly challenges you, no doubt. He toughens you up. He makes you tougher to fight, in the world and stuff. But he's always there. He's always supportive and helpful. And the bishops, it's like they just leave the priests out all on their own. And it's like the only time you ever see the bishop is when you're in trouble and he's coming down hard on you. So there's no father relationship. It's a total abandonment of fatherhood. And in many cases, it's extremely abusive. And frankly, I mean, again, I'm going to speak a little frankly, but I'm not even going to get into the worst of it. But the bishops are extremely abusive of the laity and have spiritually abandoned the fatherhood of the laity, and the priests too. So they're not doing this. They're not actually interested in our spiritual welfare and getting us to heaven. I've seen way too many bishops who don't act this way. I mean, the mere fact that they take away the Latin Mass from people is absurd. The fact that they're not teaching the true and the pure doctrine that saves. I mean, there's many things we go into there, but I've seen really abusive relationships. And because of that, it's really tough on the priests. And so I think a lot of priests, just as you say, burrow down, just as the article sort of implies, like just start living these worldly lives. Some of them might find comfort in alcohol or just watching movies or playing video games. Or, I mean, I've seen all that, and again, I have a lot of friends who became priests and I'm very kind of connected to priests because of my own experience and my brother's. I've seen it all. And in all those cases, so often it's their priesthood is taking a huge hit. And then we take a huge hit as the laity. So, I mean, that's really tough. And what the laity needs to do especially is step up and support their priests. Like you have
Oh,
got to tell your
absolutely.
priest, I've got your back. Don't ever worry about not having a place to live or food or this. We'll be there for you. And then you got to show it. And you've got to organize, and you've got to start maybe even nonprofits. We've got to get creative to support our priests that are good. Like we have to do this because they're not being taken care of. And so I'm all about saying financially support them, and then obviously support them with your words. You can invite them to lunch, you can invite them to dinner at the house. You've got to let them know that they are cared for, that they are loved for, and they are desperately needed because the priest is so valuable to us. We need our priests, and they're being treated like trash so often. Um, and so we have to like try to undo that as much as we can. That's part of the reparation. And when you do that, obviously, keep in mind you're doing it to Jesus Christ, the eternal high priest,
Mhm.
whom every one of these priests, is representing and bringing to us and bringing us into relationship with. So the article brought that up too. Like at one point in time, there was like a few paragraphs where he was saying, hey, you can pull your priest aside and tell him this is how you've helped me. This is where your priest sit. And I never tire of telling priests how much how much good they do for me, even just like for me to be faithful to my wife and faithful to my children. A priest who's really living out his priesthood well is so inspiring for you, me, a layman, to stay true to my vocation and to go at it even further. And it's nice because priests will often tell me, yeah, and me seeing you live your marriage the way you're living it out and trying to be faithful to your wife and your children and all the sufferings you endure for Christ makes me stronger in my priesthood. And so we have to realize that we're not just living our marriages for ourselves or for our wife or for our kids. We're also living it to help the church. We're helping it to help Holy Mother Church and help the priests there. So support your priests, encourage them, be faithful to
Oh,
Christ above all
absolutely.
things.
Absolutely. And I just want to add, and Kevin brought this up, and I agree with you. Probably the one critique I could give, it could be stronger. Now, the counterbalance to that is if you make it too strong, you're just going to turn people off before they read the whole article, because some people want to put those blinders on. I mean, we've seen since Traditionis Custodes, you see so many in what I like to call Catholic ink. All right, they like to say trad ink, they like to say sede ink, but Catholic ink who just, if the bishop tells you to do this, you just shut up and do it. And that's their mantra. And so why are we surprised that monsters like McCarrick rose up through the ranks? Because we've been basically told for decades, even before Vatican II, all right, that we should just shut up and do what we're told. I was just interviewed by the great Brian McCall, the redoubtable Brian McCall, just a couple of weeks ago for Catholic Family News. And, I mentioned this, is that the bishop needs to start treating his priests as sons, but not as 3-year-old sons, as adult sons. All right. And there is a difference to that. You know that personally, that the way you treat your 3-year-old is going to be a lot different than the way you treat your 30-year-old son. And we have to get back to that. So many priests I know, though, when in Rome, Rome will take their side and say, no, you have to go back in ministry. And the bishop will say, nope, sorry, I can't do that because the lawyers, the insurance companies say, sorry, you're uninsurable. And so that's how they skirt around that, because sadly, so many of these bishops don't want to admit that they're wrong. I mean, I'm going to give you just my own personal story. I was removed 6 weeks after the new bishop of Rockford came in. I mean, just he heard from the vicar of clergy and the vicar general. Out I was. Turned out later that vicar of clergy, that vicar general, also had to be removed, but actually justly because he had a prescription drug abuse problem. And I don't want to make light of that. That is a serious problem, not just in the priesthood, across our society, in American society, is becoming addicted to prescription drugs. But you know what? That priest was allowed back in. Why? Because he liked to play the game. And, sorry, I don't want to play the game. I want to make sure I get to heaven, and I want to make sure as many people I'm dragging with me, and I shouldn't say drag, but I'm bringing with me, because we're going to, I say this all the time in my homilies, we are going to be judged by how many souls we bring to Christ. And we have to realize that so much. And one thing that I've noticed is that, so many people will say to me, oh, Father, thank God with all the younger seminarians now, all those that are coming up, they're more conservative, they're more traditional, and this is a good thing. So hopefully this is going to change things. Well, they were saying that when you and I were entering the seminary in the 1990s. All right, you and I are both would be JP2 so-called seminarians, because of the witness of John Paul II. I mean, I was ordained just a year after Pope John Paul II died. So I'm very much a John Paul II seminarian. They were saying that then, but what you start to notice is, and Kevin
It's only gotten
Wells,
worse, Father.
yeah,
It's
what Kevin
only
Wells
gotten
brought
worse.
up in the article, is that the bishops pick out their own successors. All right. And it's sad because I've met a whopping 2 priests from the North American College. For everyone that's listening, that is the Bishop's Seminary in Rome for the American dioceses. I've met 2 priests that I consider not to be climbers. All right. People that are not, as we like to say, sleeping with miters under their bed, waiting for the Apostolic Nuncio to call. One is your brother, Father Michael Rodriguez, and the other one is Father Paul Czech, who used to run Courage, is the brother of Chris Czech, who runs Catholic Answers. So those are the only 2 priests. In fact, Father Paul Czech, when I first met him, and he said, "Oh, I went to the North American College. Please don't judge me for that." And because there was this thing about, oh, if you went to the North American, you were looked upon as the Ivy League compared to the rest of us that were out in the sticks, especially my seminary, Mount St. Mary's, which has always been known as the Marian Seminary in the United States. When it comes to Novus Ordo seminaries, at the time I went there, it probably was as good as it gets for Novus Ordo, and probably still is now. But it was just amazing to see priest after priest go to the North American College, or seminarian after seminarian. And then I heard, and I don't know if this is still true, because I was also working in the vocation office of my diocese, that 50% of graduates of the North American College have left the priesthood. That is a high attrition rate. And don't get me wrong, I have classmates from Mount St. Mary's, I have classmates from Conception Abbey that have left the priesthood, but it's nowhere near 50% attrition. That is amazing. But why are we surprised when we see the rector of the Basilica in Chattanooga in the Diocese of Knoxville basically telling his people that, basically, look, you have to give up the traditional mass because you're making it an idol, and there's really not much of a difference between that. That priest, I went to seminary with that priest at Conception. Again, he eventually went on to the North American College. Again, he probably has miters underneath his bed, and I don't mean that uncharitably, but it's true. When you read what they're saying is that these bishops are going to only promote priests that they feel are going to continue what they're doing. And so we have to be very, very careful with that. And we have to realize that we have to start looking, both as laity and priests, to building up a better understanding of what it means to be a priest. And I think Kevin does hit that a little bit. He won't go this far, and a lot of people don't want to bring this up, all right? But you have to give much credit to Archbishop Lefebvre, because what a lot of people don't realize, he did not just found a society of priests. In fact, that wasn't even his original intention. He wanted to found a seminary that taught Catholicism. All right. Plain and
Simple.
simple. He wanted to make sure that priests were properly trained. And in the early days of the Icone Seminary, they had no thought of keeping them. We're going to train them, and then you go be incarnated into a diocese, join a diocese. That's what incarnation means. And you will be part of that diocese, but you will be properly trained. And what we need to start to realize is that if we're going to have better priests, yes, first and foremost, the family must improve. But second, we need to have better formation, and we need to have continuing formation for priests. And that's something at Unprofitable Servants, which is now the successor of Coalition for Canceled Priests, is that we're trying to do, is we want to make sure that the priests are given the opportunity to build their formation and continue that. I've said this before, lawyers, doctors, they have to routinely go back and take classes in order to keep up with their license. Priests are the same way. A priest that stops reading philosophy, stops reading theology, all right, is eventually going to dry up. And we cannot have that. We need priests who are able to do that. And what we're seeing instead is priests that run into the rectory basically to hide, basically to relax and not to be with the people. And I've often been told this, that how easy going I am around people in public, and you know, they'll say I'm not an introvert, whatever extrovert and introvert means. I can tell you though, you know, after doing 3, 4 masses on a Sunday when I was in active ministry, the last thing I wanted to do was to go over to somebody's house for dinner or to go bless somebody's home that just moved into the parish. But I forced myself to do it simply because I realized not only this is what God wanted, I was actually charging my batteries, even though it didn't feel like it. You know, because we've become sadly such a culture of feelings. And I can tell you, I've never regretted forcing myself to go out and to actually be with the sheep. And you know, Pope Francis said this to smell like them, and then he kind of really didn't do it, and surrounded himself with clerics that really didn't do that. But you know, if we're going to truly be priests of Jesus Christ, we have to look, as Kevin says in the article, and I hope to have him on soon to discuss this further. Obviously, his family has dealt with great tragedy with the murder of his uncle, but we need priests like St. John Vianney. And I can tell you this as we're wrapping up, and I'll give you the last word, David, is that you have another John Vianney. We probably would make him blush if he heard this, and your brother, Father Michael Rodriguez. Every time I've spoken with him, every time I've seen him, he is certainly made me want to become a better priest, and I appreciate that. So, David, to you, the last word.
Well, I mean, I won't call him a John Vianney at all, although that is one of his favorite patron saints. I know a lot about him, and I can tell some great stories about him, maybe for another day. No, I mean, I do. I mean, I want to hit a few things, if I may, Father. One is just, again, so that people realize that I thought of this when you're talking about how, you know, back in the 90s, people were saying, oh, it's going to get better. The young crop is coming in. I don't think people have a understanding how formation is so important. Because one of the things that I've seen happen again and again is these guys, and I was one of them. You know, when I got to Mundelein, I mean, they saw me as like the leader of my class in terms of orthodoxy, and we're talking about how, you know, the older guys, the fourth year guys, they wouldn't wear their clerics or anything, and we're like, we're gonna wear our clerics, and we would get together and pray a rosary. Like I had a group around me, and you know, the other people were doing that, and so it was interesting because you saw like a difference between the fourth year guys that are about to be ordained and the first year guys who certainly had more zeal. And it's not just because they were like, I don't know, a different generation. It wasn't. It's because it hadn't been there for 4 years. And what happens over those 4 years when you're in the seminary is you have all these great ideas of how you want to be a good priest and be faithful, but the formation process doesn't really let you. And you realize you kind of got to duck your head. You got to keep low. Don't open your mouth too much. Don't say too much. And then you keep telling yourself, when I get to be a priest, you know, then now that I'm a priest and I'm ordained, then I'll like, you know, do this. But 4 years of formation or 8 years of formation has an effect on you, because then you get to be a priest, and now you're in the parish, and those dreams you had, suddenly you got a pastor over you, and there's a vicariate, and you realize that you don't want to get on their bad side. So you like, okay, I got to keep my head down. I got to keep my head down until I become a pastor. And then you keep your head down and don't say too much and don't rock waves until you become a pastor. And now it's, you know, it's been 10, 15 years and you're formed and you're a different kind of person. And even then you start wanting to climb the ladder. And so what happens is you get those pastors who have totally, if they had zeal in the beginning, they've lost it over these decades of bad formation and how we sort of form ourselves. And it's only from that crop that the bishops get picked. And so then the bishops get there. And oftentimes what I've also learned, people don't want to hear this, but a lot of time, because I've known priests who get the call to be a bishop and like, I don't want to be a bishop. And they say no. And you're like, oh man, maybe we could have got a good one there. But they also realize what's going on with the bishopric, because a lot of times they don't make you a bishop unless they have stuff that they can blackmail you with. They want crazy control. And so I mean, it's a terrible culture. Like they're only advancing you because they can blackmail you and control you. One of the saddest stories I heard was a young man who actually was a knacker. A priest was a knacker and became a bishop. And this question was asked to him. My brother knows him, but it was asked him, you know, what's been like the greatest grace, maybe the greatest difficulty in being a bishop? You know, what surprised you the most? He said, well, the greatest grace is there really is grace from the office. Like I know there's this grace that like I'm getting. He goes, the worst thing though was my own brother colleagues. So he tells us how he showed up to the USCCB meeting and there was some topic being discussed of which he actually knew a lot about. And so, you know, I guess in a time for like when you can make statements, he stood up, he made like 4 or 5 points and then sat back down, knowledgeable about the matter, et cetera. When they took break, He was literally physically cornered in a hallway corner by 3 or 4 other bishops who like got in his face and were so menacing and were like, you will never do that again. Like, you do not speak like unless you're allowed. You don't say these things. And he said, I couldn't believe the malice and the intimidation and like the evil coming forth of these men. These were my brother bishops. Like, this is the fraternity I'm now in of brother bishops.
Hmm.
And that was a story that I'm sure people don't think. People don't think of the bishops running things like a mafia. Like, it's real sad. And so then you get into that culture and just to survive, you go along. You go along and you get dragged into it. And this is where we have to pray so much into a lot of prayer and fasting for our bishops and our priests, because, that evil culture just like eats you up. And that's a tough part of it. So I don't see how we're getting out of this again without Fatima. It's Our Lady that we're going to have to turn to and heed the message of Fatima in order for us to get out of this mess, because the rot is so deep and so pervasive, and the evil and like I say, the blackmail they've got on each other, that there is no human solution within the church. And I don't know if people really realize that yet. It's not going to get better. It's only getting worse. It's going to continue to get worse until we turn to Our Lady of Fatima. That's our only solution left at this point, to
Oh,
heed her message and
absolutely.
live
I
it.
completely agree. And ladies and gentlemen, please, David, what is the Fatima Center's website? Is it fatima.org?
That's correct, Father.
Fatima,
Fatima.org.
Fatima, Fatima.org. There are a lot of Fatima organizations out there. But if you want the one that kind of cuts through all the bull and gives you the authentic message, it is Fatima.org, the Fatima Center, started by Father Gruner. I always, David knows this anytime I go on his show, is that always remember Fatima is chapter 2. Our Lady of La Salette is chapter 1. You really have to bring those two together to see what is going on in the church, as well with Our Lady of Akita in Japan. It is so important to look at these apparitions and keep in mind too. There have been wonderful apparitions of Mary warning us, of Mary bringing us joy, like at Our Lady of Lourdes, and thanking us for the declaration of the Immaculate Conception. I firmly believe that's why Lourdes happened. But please check out fatima.org. Also, please like and subscribe on any platform that you see Hope in the Desert on. And please go, if you'd like to see more of these shows and to contribute to Unprofitable Servants, please go to unprofitableservants.org. David Rodriguez of the Fatima Center. Thank you, David, again. Everyone, have a wonderful day and God bless.